was called up, that was it. He didn't want to anymore. Bring another war orphan into the world, not a chance. I'm one myself, I know what it's like. And that's the way it's been, up to now. Even so, we feel just as tied to each other as if we were married. Except I haven't heard from him for over 9 weeks. His last letter was posted from the Siegfried line. I hardly know what he looks like anymore. All my photos were bombed, except the one I had in my bag, and I tore that up on account of the uniform. Even if he was just an NCO, I was afraid. The whole building got rid of anything that had to do with soldiers, anything that might upset the Russians. They all burned books too, but at least when the books went up in smoke they provided some warmth, a little hot soup. We'd barely managed to drink our ersatz coffee and eat a few buttered slices of the plundered bread when Anatole's men marched in. Our place has become a kind of restaurant for them, albeit one where the guests bring their own food. This time they brought a decent man along, the best I've met so far. André, a sergeant, a schoolteacher by profession. Narrow forehead, icy blue eyes, quiet and intelligent. My first political conversation. That's not as difficult as it sounds, since all the words having to do with politics and the economy have Latin or Greek roots, so they sound similar in both languages. André is an orthodox Marxist. He doesn't blame Hitler personally for the war. Instead, he faults capitalism, which spawns the Hitlers of the world and stockpiles war material. He thinks that Russia and Germany make a good economic match, that Germany can be a natural partner for Russia once it has been built up along socialist lines. The conversation did me a lot of good, and not so much because of the subject, which I'm not as well versed in as André, but simply because one of them treated me as an equal, without once touching me, not even with his eyes. He didn't see me as a mere piece of female flesh, like all the others up to now. People were coming and going throughout the morning, while André sat on the sofa writing his report. As long as he's there, we feel secure. He brought a Russian army newspaper. I deciphered the familiar names of Berlin districts. There's not much left of our city that's still German. Other than that, we feel completely at the mercy of anyone and everyone. When we're alone, we jump at every noise, every step. The widow and I huddle around Herr Pauli's bed, the way we are right now as I'm writing this. We linger for hours in the dark, icy room. Ivan has driven us to the very depths, even literally in some cases. There are still a few groups on our block that haven't been discovered, families who have been living in their basement since Friday, who only send people out early in the morning for water. I think our men must feel even dirtier than we do, solid as we women are. In the queue at the pump, one woman told me how her neighbour reacted when the Russians fell on her in her basement. He simply shouted, "Well, why don't you just go with them? You're putting all of us in danger." A minor footnote to the decline of the West. I'm constantly repulsed by my own skin. I don't want to touch myself, can barely look at my body. I can't help but think about the little child I was once upon a time, the little pink and white baby who made her parents so proud, as my mother told me over and over. And when my father had to become a soldier in 1916, when he said goodbye to my mother at the train station, he reminded her never to forget to put my lace bonnet on to protect me from the sun, so that I would have a lily-white neck and a lily-white face. That was the fashion of the times for girls from good homes. So much love, so much bother with sunbonnets, bath thermometers, and evening prayers, and all for the filth I am now. Back to Sunday. It's difficult to recollect everything. My mind is such a jumble. By 10 a.m. all the usual guests were gathered. André, Petka, Grisha, Yasha, and little Vanya as well, who once again washes our dishes in the kitchen. They ate, drank, and chatted away. At one point Vanya told me, his child's face turning very serious, "We humans are all bad. Me too. I've done bad things." Then Anatole showed up, lugging a record player, I have no idea from where, with 2 of his entourage carrying the records. And what do they keep playing, over and over, at least a dozen times? After quickly sampling and rejecting records like Lohengrin and Beethoven's Ninth, Brahms and Smetana, an advertising jingle, a record the C&A Textile Company on the Spittal marked used to give customers for buying a certain amount. Stroll on down to C&A and see what's in our store today, followed by a list of their entire collection, crooned to the rhythm of a foxtrot. But that's just what Ivan wants. They start warbling along, happy as larks. Once again the spirits are going around the table. Anatole gets the familiar glint in his eye and finally kicks everybody out under fairly obvious pretences. This particular door doesn't even have a lock. He simply shoves the wing chair against it. Meanwhile, I can't stop thinking about my conversation with the widow this morning at the oven. I make myself stiff as stone, shut my eyes, concentrate on my body's veto, my inner no. He moves the chair back away from the door to let the widow in with the soup tureen. She and I take our places at the table. Even Herr Pauli comes hobbling in from his room, perfectly shaved and manicured, in a silk robe. But Anatole stays sprawled across the bedstead, his legs dangling in their boots, his black hair tousled. He sleeps and sleeps, gently exhaling. For 3 hours he sleeps, like a baby, all alone with us 3 enemies. But we feel safer even when he's sleeping. Anatole is our earthwork, our rampart. He snores away, his revolver stuck in his holster. And outside there's war, the crackle of gunfire, the centre of town all in smoke. The widow takes out a bottle of the burgundy I looted from the police barracks and serves it to us in coffee cups, just in case of Russians. We talk very quietly, so as not to wake Anatole. It does us good to be together like this, polite and friendly. We enjoy an hour of calm, the chance to be nice to one another. Our souls recover somewhat. Around 4 p.m, Anatole wakes up and rushes out, head over heels, to attend to some duty. A little later we hear loud banging on the front door. We tremble, my heart skips a beat. Thank God it's only André, the schoolteacher with the icy blue eyes. We beam at him. The widow hugs him with relief. He smiles back. We have a good conversation, this time about humanity, not politics. He lectures about himself, about how he sees women as comrades and not mere female bodies, how he disapproves of that kind of thing. And here he looks past me, awkward and embarrassed. André is a fanatic. His eyes are far away as he says this. He is convinced that his dogma is infallible. There are times now when I have to wonder whether my knowing some Russian is a good thing or a bad thing. On the one hand, it gives me a degree of assurance the others don't have. What they consider animal grunting and screaming is for me a real human tongue, the richly nuanced, melodious language of Pushkin and Tolstoy. Of course, I'm afraid, though a little bit less because of Anatole. But at least I speak with them as one person to another. At least I can tell who's truly evil from who is bearable, can picture them as separate human beings, distinguish them as individuals. For the first time, I also have a sense of being a witness. There probably aren't many in this city who can talk to them, who've seen their birch trees and their villages, and the peasants in their bast sandals, and all the new, hastily constructed buildings they're so proud of, and that are now, like me, nothing more than filth beneath their boots. By the same token, it's also easier for those who don't understand a word of Russian. For them, the Russians are more alien. They can talk themselves into the idea that these men aren't people but savages, mere animals. They can bury their feelings deeper. I can't do that. I know they're people, just like we are, less highly developed perhaps, as it seems to me, and younger as a nation, but closer to their roots. This is probably how the Teutons acted when they sacked Rome, snatching the perfumed Roman ladies with their pedicures and manicures and artificial curls. Being conquered means having salt rubbed in your wounds. Around 6 p.m. there was a sudden shouting in the stairwell, a knock at the door, the prearranged dactyl. They've looted the basement." Andre, who's sitting on our sofa, nods. He tells us that he's known about it for hours, advises us to go right away and see to our things. Absolute chaos below. Wooden partitions battered down, locks torn off, trunks slit open and trampled. We stumble over things that don't belong to us, tread on laundry that's still clean and crisply creased. We held up a candle stump to light our corner, salvage this and that, a few towels, a side of bacon on the string. The widow complains that the big trunk with all her best clothes is missing. In the corridor she dumps out someone else's suitcase that's been split open and starts filling it with the few things she has left, using her hands to shovel flour that's spilled on the floor, as if she's lost her mind. Left and right the neighbours rummage about by flickering candlelight. Shrill cries and wailing. Eidered down whirls through the air. The place reeks of spilled wine and excrement. We drag our things upstairs. Andre is clearly embarrassed about the looting. He consoles us by saying that he's sure they were only looking for alcohol, and that even though everything else has been turned upside down, there shouldn't be anything missing. Then, half in Russian, half in German, Vanya, the child, who has shown up in the meantime as well, promises the widow with a serious expression in his black eyes that he'll go with us in the morning when it's daylight and stay by our side until we've found everything that belongs to us. The widow cries, sobbing afresh each time she recalls a specific item from her trunk. Her good suit, her knitted dress, her well-made shoes. I too am despondent. We have no rights. We are nothing but booty, dirt. We unload our rage on Adolf. Anxiously we ask where the front is, when there will be peace. While we whisper among ourselves at Herr Pauli's bed, where he retreated once again after eating his midday meal, Andre holds a war council with his comrades at the mahogany table. Suddenly all the window casements fly open, pieces of cardboard whiz through the room, an explosion throws me against the opposite wall. Something crunching, grinding, then a cloud of dust in the room, and a wall comes crashing down somewhere outside. As we learn from a neighbour half an hour later, a German mortar shell hit the house next door, wounding several Russians and killing a horse. We find the animal in the courtyard the next morning, the meat neatly removed and lying on a bloody sheet, the fatty entrails coiled on the wet red earth beside it. Exactly how the evening passed escapes me at the moment. Presumably alcohol, bread, herring, canned meat, coitus, Anatole. Now I have it. A whole tableful of Russians, known and unknown. They keep pulling out their watches, comparing the time, the Moscow time they brought with them, which is an hour ahead of ours. One of the men has a thick old turnip of a watch, an East Prussian brand, with a shiny yellow, highly concave dial. Why are they so fixated on watches? It's not because of the monetary value. They don't ogle rings and earrings and bracelets the same way at all. They'll overlook them if they can lay their hands on another watch. It's probably because in their country watches aren't available for just anyone and haven't been for a long time. You have to be really somebody before you can get a wristwatch, that is, before the state allots you something so coveted. And now they're springing up like radishes ripe for the picking, in undreamt-of abundance. With every new watch, the owner feels an increase in power. With every watch he can present or give away back home, his status rises. That must be it. Because they can't distinguish a cheap watch from an expensive one. They prefer the ones with bells and whistles, stopwatches, or a revolving face beneath a metal case. A gaudy picture on the dial also attracts them. I look at the men's hands resting on our table, and felt a sudden twinge of disgust at their bald show of strength. What is clinging to those hands? I chase the feeling down with some brandy. They shout, "Vipit, nado!" whenever I put the glass to my lips, and celebrate each swallow as if it were a deed worthy of distinction. This time there's red wine in addition to the spirits, probably from the basement. A candle fixed to a saucer provides a flickering light, casting the Slavic profiles on the wall. For the first time we have a real discussion. with at least 3 highly talented debaters. Andrei with the icy blue eyes, schoolteacher and chess player, composed and quiet as always. Then a man from the Caucasus with a hooked nose and a fiery gaze. "I'm not Jewish, I'm from Georgia," was how he introduced himself to me. He's amazingly well read, able to quote fluently both verse and prose, very eloquent, and as adroit as a fencing master. The third intellectual is also here for the first time, a lieutenant, extremely young, wounded this evening by some shrapnel. He has a makeshift bandage on his shin and limps around with a German hiking pole, decorated with all sorts of badges from well-known destinations in the Harz Mountains. He is pale blonde and has an ominous look and a nasty way of speaking. He starts to say, "As an intelligent person, I—" whereupon the Georgian interrupts him. "There are other intelligent people here too. The Nemka, for example," meaning me. We talk about how the war started. They see the root cause in fascism, in a system driven towards conquest. Shaking their heads, they explained that there was absolutely no reason for Germany to go to war at all. Such a wealthy country, so cultured, so well tended, even now, despite the destruction. For a while the discussion turns to the stunted form of early capitalism that was inherited by the October Revolution, and to the later stage that is evident in Germany, where capitalist society is more advanced in wealth as well as decadence. Suddenly cautious, they put forward tentative arguments for why their country is on the verge of a great development, and therefore should be considered, critiqued and compared only from the perspective of the future. One of the men points to the 19th century-style furniture in the room as an example of a superior culture. Finally they come to the subject of degeneration, and argue whether we Germans are degenerate or not. They enjoy the gamesmanship, the lively back and forth of the debate. Andrei guides the conversation with a gentle rein and a quiet voice. Every now and then the wounded lieutenant directs a vicious outburst against me personally. Scorn and ridicule for Germany's plans of conquest, for its defeat. The others, displaying a sense of tact more becoming to a victor, refuse to follow suit, quickly changing the subject and telling him to watch his language. Then, in the middle of all this talk, Anatole comes bursting in, yawning, exhausted from work. He sits down a while, but soon gets bored. He can't keep up with the others. He's from the countryside, from the kolkhoz. He's told me that he was in charge of milk, a kind of dairy manager. "How interesting," I said. "It's all right, you know, but milk all the time, nothing but milk." And he sighed. Half an hour later he goes, leaving the others to debate. Herr Pauli is sleeping in the next room. Once again the widow has set up her improvised bed close to him. Otherwise the situation is clear. The apartment is open to a few friends of the house, if that's what they can be called, as well as to the men Anatole brings from his platoon, and no one else. But only their chief, only Anatole, has the right to spend the night. It seems that I really am taboo, at least for today. But who can say about tomorrow? Anatole comes back around midnight, whereupon the debaters disperse on their own. The last one out is the blonde lieutenant, who limps away with his hiking pole, sizing me up with evil eyes. Now there are holes in my memory. Once again I drank a great deal, can't recall the details. The next thing I remember is Monday morning, the grey light of dawn, a conversation with Anatole that led to a minor misunderstanding. I said to him, "You are a bear." I know the word well, Medved, which was also the name of a well-known Russian restaurant on Tauentzienstrasse. Anatole, however, thought I was getting my words mixed up, so he corrected me very patiently, the way you'd speak to a child. "No, that's wrong. A medved is an animal, a brown animal in the forest. It's big and roars. I am a chilavek, a person." Looking back on Monday the 30th of April, 1945. Recorded on Tuesday, 1st of May. The day breaks grey and pink. The cold blows through the empty window sockets, filling our mouths with the taste of smoke. Once again the roosters. I have this early hour all to myself. I wipe everything down, sweep away cigarette butts, breadcrumbs, fish bones, rub out the rings from the tabletop. Then a frugal wash in the tub, with 2 cups of water. This is my happiest time between 5 and 7 in the morning, while the widow and Herr Pauli are still asleep. If happy is the right word. It's a relative happiness. I do some mending and then soap up my extra shirt. We know from experience that no Russians come at this early hour. But from 8 a.m. on, the back door is open to the usual traffic. Unknown men of all descriptions. 2 or 3 burst in out of the blue, start pestering the widow and me, randy as goats, try to grab hold of us. But now it's the custom of one of our recent acquaintances to come and help us shake them off. I heard Grisha mentioning Anatole by name, affirming the taboo. And I'm very proud I actually managed to tame one of the wolves, most likely the strongest in the pack too, to keep away the others. Around 10 a.m. we climb up to the booksellers, where a dozen of the local tenants are still being sheltered, behind the excellent security locks. We give the special knock, the door opens, we join the other residents for the arranged meeting. A jostle of men and women. It takes me a while to recognize individual cave dwellers. Some of them look unbelievably different. Overnight, practically all the women have grey or grey-streaked hair. They can't get their usual hair dye. Their faces, too, look unfamiliar, older, distraught. We draw around the table, hastily, for fear the Russians will discover our assembly and misinterpret it. Very quickly, as fast as I can speak, I report what news I've gleaned from the Russian papers, and from the Russians themselves, mostly Andrei and Anatole. Berlin is completely encircled. All the outlying districts are occupied. The only places still resisting are Tiergarten and Moabit. Huge numbers of generals have been captured. They say that Hitler is dead, but give no details, that Goebbels has committed suicide, that the Italians have shot Mussolini. The Russians have reached the Elbe, where they've met up and are fraternizing with the Americans. Everyone listens eagerly. It's all news to them. I look around, ask the woman from Hamburg about her daughter, 18-year-old Stinchin with a bandaged head. She answers, with her sharp S's, that the girl has moved into the crawl space above the false kitchen ceiling in their apartment, and spends every night and most of the day up there under the real ceiling. The Russians don't know about crawl spaces and false ceilings. They don't have that kind of thing back home. In the old days, people would store their trunks there. Before that, they were used as maids' quarters, or so they say. So now Stinchin is vegetating away in that cramped, stuffy space, equipped with bedclothes, a chamber pot, and some eau de cologne. Her mother says that at the first sign of footsteps or any other noise, she quickly shuts the hatch. At least she's still a virgin. We feel our way back downstairs. Our building has long since become a regular barracks. The stench of horses is everywhere, the whole place sprinkled with manure tracked in by the soldiers. These victors also feel free to piss on any wall any time they choose. Puddles of urine in the stairwell, on the landings, in the entrance hall. Evidently they do the same in the abandoned apartments that they now have entirely to themselves. Vanya, the child, is already waiting in our kitchen, erect as a sentry, his machine gun at the ready. With the look of a loyal dog, he offers to escort us to the basement. So once again we went down into the dark. Several Russians are still sprawled out in the back hallway, slumbering into the day, on proper bedding too, which they've managed to get hold of somewhere. One of them is lying right under the spiral staircase, blocking our way, in his own little puddle still trickling from his body. Vanya kicks him, and he moves aside, muttering under his breath. Even though he's just 16, Vanya is a sergeant, and demands that his rank is respected. Andrei has told me that Vanya was sent to labour on an estate in East Prussia, but joined the advancing Russian army and quickly climbed the ranks, thanks to various heroic deeds. We grope around the basement, looking for the widow's things. Things that I wouldn't recognise, and that the widow doesn't want to identify too carefully, as she is simply grabbing whatever she feels might come in useful. By the faint glow from the upper windows, amplified by Vanya's torch, we gather potatoes and onions, and even find a number of jars of preserves, still intact, which we take down off one of the shelves. A man comes up, eyes like slits, makes some lewd comments mixed with German words, whereupon Vanya says, as if to no one in particular, "All right, that's enough," and the slit-eyed man moves on. The midday meal. We still have more than enough to eat. Compared to my meagre meals alone in the attic, I'm living well here. No more nettles. Now there's meat, bacon, butter, peas, onions, canned vegetables. Even on his bed of pain, Herr Pauli manages to eat like a horse, until he starts cursing when he bites into a stewed pear and pulls a long, sharp splinter of glass out of his mouth. I find myself chewing on something jagged as well. Obviously one of the jars we brought from the basement was chipped. Outside, the war is still on, and we have a new morning and evening prayer. For all of this we thank the Führer. A line we knew from the years before the war, when it was printed in praise and thanksgiving on thousands of posters, proclaimed in speeches. Today, the exact same words have precisely the opposite meaning, full of scorn and derision. I believe that's what's called a dialectic conversion. A quiet afternoon. Anatole is out with his men. Evidently they're preparing a May Day celebration. That makes us anxious. Supposedly all Russians are to get an extra ration of vodka. No Anatole. But around 9 p.m. someone else shows up instead. A small man on the older side, pockmarked and with scarred cheeks. My heart pounds. What a terrible-looking face. But it turns out he has good manners, uses highly refined language, and is very solicitous. He's also the first soldier to address me as Grazdanka, meaning citizen, which the Russians use for foreign women whom they can't refer to as comrade. He introduces himself as Anatole's new orderly, charged with informing us that his superior will be joining us for supper and with procuring the necessary provisions. He tells me all of this from outside the door, which I haven't unchained. I let him in, offer him a seat. Clearly he was hoping to get into a conversation with me. He's bound to realise that his face isn't one to inspire confidence, so he's twice as eager to please in some other way. He mentions that he's from the Caucasus, from an area that Pushkin visited, and where he found much inspiration. I can't understand everything, since the man is using very sophisticated expressions and constructing long, elaborate sentences. Still, I take my cue from Pushkin and manage to name a few titles. Boris Godunov and the Postmaster. I tell him that they'd made a film of the Postmaster in Germany a few years back. The orderly is clearly pleased to hear it. In short, a genuine parlour conversation, very unusual. I don't know how to read these men, and am always taken aback at how they surprise us. A sudden noise, men's voices in the kitchen. Anatole? The little orderly doesn't think so. We both rush to the kitchen, run into the widow, who is fleeing in visible terror. "Watch out! It's Petka!" Petka? My God, so he's still around. Petka with the blonde bristles and the lumberjack paws that shook so much when he launched into his Romeo babble. The three of us advance into the room. A small Hindenburg lamp on the pantry is giving out its last light. Apart from that, there's a flickering gleam from a dying torch, swung by a Russian I've never seen before. The other man is Petka, no doubt about it, I can tell from his voice. Since the day before yesterday, hard to believe, but it really was just 2 days ago, his love for me has turned to hate. As soon as he catches sight of me, the spurned Siberian comes lunging my way. His bristles are standing on end. Who knows where his cap is? His small eyes are glistening. He's dead drunk. There's a sewing machine in the corner next to the window. Petka picks the whole thing up by its locked cover and hurls it across the kitchen at me. The heavy piece goes crashing onto the tiles. I duck and call out to the orderly, "Go and get Anatole." Then I dash behind the other soldier, the one I don't know, who came in with Petka, beg him to help me warn off the drunken man. Petka starts swinging at me with his fists, but keeps missing because he's so drunk. Then, without warning, he blows out the Hindenburg lamp. The torch battery dies as well. We're completely in the dark. I hear Petka panting, smell the alcohol on his breath. I'm not frightened, not at all. I'm too busy trying to dodge him, trying to trip him, and I sense that I have allies near at hand. Finally we manage to manoeuvre him to the back door. The torch gives 1 or 2 final flashes. We shove Petka down the spiral staircase, hear him falling down several steps. As he stumbles, he calls out to me how bad I am, nothing but filth, tells me to take my mother and... It's 1 a.m., so it's already Tuesday. May Day. Exhausted, I plop down in the wing chair. The small orderly goes back out, this time to get Anatole for sure. I keep my ears pricked, doze a bit. The widow and Herr Pauli are bound to have gone to sleep a long time ago. But I don't dare to, so I wait. At last there's a knock at the front door. It's the orderly again, now loaded with bacon, bread, herring, a canteen full of vodka. Teetering with fatigue, I search the kitchen for some plates and glasses, then set the table with his help. The herring fillets are fully boned and daintily curled. I yawn. The orderly consoles me. Anatole will be right over. And he really does show up 10 minutes later, along with the pale blonde lieutenant, still limping on his German hiking pole. Anatole pulls me on his knee and yawns. Ah, to sleep. No sooner have the 4 of us sat down to eat and drink than there's another knock at the door. One of Anatole's men, sent to bring Anatole and his orderly to their commander. Something seems to be going on, or maybe it has to do with the May Day celebration. Anatole sighs, gets up, goes out. The little orderly takes a hefty bite of bacon sandwich and follows his superior, still chewing. They're gone, leaving me alone with the blonde lieutenant. Restless, he hobbles around the room leaning on his stick, sits back down, fixes me with his eyes. The candle is flickering. I'm so tired I nearly fall off my chair. I can't think of a single word in Russian. He gapes in front of him, announces that he wants to stay here. I start to show him to the back room. No, he wants to stay in this room. I put a blanket on the sofa. No, he wants the bed. He whines on one note, stubborn, like an overly tired child. Fine, let him go ahead. I lie down on the sofa just as I am, fully dressed. No, I should go to bed with him. But I don't want to. He starts to pester me on the sofa. I threaten with Anatole. He laughs crudely. He won't be coming back tonight. I get up to move to the front room, or in with the widow, somewhere. He gives in, says he's content to take the sofa, wraps himself in the blanket. So I lie down on the bed and take off my shoes. A little later I jump up startled, hearing his pole tapping in the darkness, nearer and nearer. He's back, wants to get into bed with me. I'm drunk with fatigue. I resist, babble something, but I don't want to. With a dull, dogged, cheerless insistence, he refuses to give up, peevishly repeating, "But I'm young." He can't be more than 20. Once, as I'm resisting, I manage to hit his wounded leg. He groans, curses me, takes a swing at me with his fist. Then he bends over the edge of the bed, feeling for something on the floor. A moment later I realise that he's looking for his hiking pole, which he left next to the bed, a knobbly wooden stick. One blow on the head with that and I'm done for. I try to grasp his hands, pull him away from the edge of the bed. He starts trying to nuzzle me again. I say, keeping my voice low, "That's just like a dog." That turns out to please him, immensely. He repeats my words, sullenly, tenaciously. "Yes, that's good. Just like dogs, very good. The way dogs love. Just like dogs love." Meanwhile, both of us are so exhausted we fall asleep for a few minutes. Then he starts rooting around and pushing again. I'm so sore, so wrecked. I go on resisting, stupefied, half asleep. His lips are very cold. Around 5 a.m. at the first cockcrow, he gets up with difficulty, rolls up his trouser leg and pulls the grubby bandage off his jagged wound. I shrink back involuntarily, then ask, "Can I help?" He shakes his head, stares at me a while, then spits right in front of my bed, spits contempt. He leaves. One nightmare fades away. I sleep like a log for 3 hours more. Tuesday, 1st of May, 1945. Afternoon. We started off anxious and apprehensive, sitting in the kitchen from 8 a.m. on, already worn out, waiting for whatever new evil the day might bring. But it began the same as always. Suddenly the kitchen was full of men, some familiar, some we'd never seen. One, dressed in a white smock, introduced himself as a baker, and quietly promised flour and bread, much flour and much bread, if I... Most of them say love, or even marry, or sometimes simply sleep with. But all this man did was look off to the side. Some shouting came up from the street, and they all rushed out of the kitchen. A little later they were lined up in 2 rows, right in full view under the maple tree. Anatole was pacing in front of them, every inch the sub-lieutenant, but clearly in high spirits. He was giving a speech, his hands stuck in the pockets of his leather jacket. I could make out a few bits and pieces. The 1st of May, victory at hand, enjoy yourselves, but remember what Comrade Stalin has decreed, etc. Then he gave his men a roguish wink, and the men grinned back. André stepped up, asked a question, and got an answer. 2 or 3 others raised their hands as well, just like in school. Then they started asking questions and speaking without restraint. I saw no signs of military discipline, no tight ranks or smart saluting. Comrade Sub-Lieutenant was acting very comradely indeed. Throughout the ceremony, the katyushas by the school kept howling away, leaving trails of fire across the sulphur-yellow sky. I was miserable, sore, barely dragging myself around. The widow got her medicine chest out from the crawl space where she'd hidden it, and gave me a tin with some remnants of Vaseline. I couldn't help thinking about how good I'd had it until now. The fact that love had always been a pleasure and never a pain. I had never been forced, nor had I ever had to force myself. Everything had been good the way it was. But what's making me so miserable right now is not so much the excess itself, extreme though it is. It's the fact that my body has been mistreated, taken against its will, and pain is how it responds to the abuse. I'm reminded of a girlfriend from school, now married, who confessed to me at the beginning of the war that in a certain way she felt physically better without her husband, who had been drafted, than she had earlier in the marriage. Consummation of the marriage had always been painful and joyless, though she did the best she could to keep this from her husband. That's probably what they mean by frigid. Her body wasn't ready. And frigid is what I've been during these encounters. It can't be otherwise, nor should it be. As long as I'm nothing more than a spoil of war, I intend to stay dead and numb, without feeling. Around noon, I was able to save 2 lives, just by chance. It started when a German, an older man I didn't know, knocked on our front door and called out for the lady who knows Russian, meaning me. I have to admit I was reluctant to go with him, since he was mumbling something about revolvers and shooting, but in the end I followed him downstairs. To my relief I saw that the Russians were Anatole's men, mostly NCOs. Thanks to Anatole's basic instruction, I'm now pretty good at distinguishing the ranks. The elderly postmaster was there as well, in his slippers, completely silent, his face to the wall, his shoulders slumped, his head sunk. His wife, beside him, had turned round, and kept yammering the same words over and over, very fast. What was going on? Apparently, the refugee girl who had been lodged at the postmaster's, who just this past Saturday morning had been moaning to us about not being able to go on any more and ending it all, apparently she'd been caught in the stairwell with a revolver in her coat pocket. She probably brought it all the way from Königsberg. No one really knows for sure. Anyhow, she broke away from her pursuers, raced up the stairs, and somehow vanished in the maze of attic rooms. No one's seen her since. So they ransacked the postmaster's whole apartment and found, God forbid, a photo of her, next to a soldier from the SS. The Russians have the picture right there. They show it to me. I have to verify that it is indeed the girl from Königsberg. The SS man could be her fiancé, or most likely her brother, since he has the same large head. So the Russians have detained the elderly couple as hostages. Now they've threatened to shoot them if they don't produce the girl, if they don't say where she is hiding. I can start by clearing up a misconception. The Russians think the postmaster and his wife are the girl's parents. Evidently these men are still used to proper families. They don't realise how jumbled and scattered our homes have become, aren't familiar with our patchwork households. As soon as they learn that the girl is only lodging there, that she was a complete stranger, they change their tone. And right away the old woman, who's been watching us closely, her frightened eyes going back and forth between the Russians and me, right away she takes advantage of a lull in the conversation and starts cursing and vilifying the girl from Königsberg, hoping to curry favour with the Russians. They'd been forced to take the girl in. They're fed up with her. She's nothing but trouble. They aren't surprised at anything. And if the woman knew where the girl was hiding, she'd say. After all, she has no reason to keep it a secret. And so on. She really would give the girl away if she could. No doubt about it. She keeps repeating the same nonsense, her voice shaking with fear, while her husband keeps standing there with his face to the wall, impassive and inert. Meanwhile, I talk and talk, explaining to the Russians that the girl couldn't possibly have intended to kill any of them, that I myself had heard her say she was planning to commit suicide, which she's probably long since done. Maybe they'll find her body very soon. The word for suicide, samobójstwo, isn't in the soldier's dictionary either. I got Andrei to teach it to me. Little by little, the tension eases. I go so far as to portray the postmaster and his wife in a comic light, as a pair of silly old fools who don't have a clue about anything. In the end, the postmaster turns back from the wall, threads of saliva dribbling from his open mouth, just like a baby. The woman is silent, her bright old lady eyes darting wildly between the Russians and me. Finally, they are both allowed to leave, unscathed. The Russians instruct me to inform all the civilians in the building that if another weapon is found, the entire place will be burned to the ground, according to martial law. And they swear to find the girl and liquidate her. My merry vodka drinkers are completely changed, beyond recognition. They give not the slightest indication of all the times they've sat at our little round table and drunk my health. Their happy singing doesn't mean a thing, evidently. Work is work, and drink is drink, at least for these three. I better make a note of that, and be careful with them. Afterwards I am quite pleased with myself, but also scared. Intervening like that is a good way to attract attention, and sticking out like a sore thumb won't do me a bit of good. I have to admit that I'm afraid. I'd like to stay hidden. As I was leaving, the German who'd fetched me asked me to translate a Russian phrase he'd heard many times, Hitler durach. I told him what it means. Hitler is a fool. The Russians say it all the time, triumphantly, as if it were their own discovery. Wednesday, 2nd of May, 1945, and the rest of Tuesday. I spent half of Tuesday afternoon sitting by Herr Pauli's bed, updating my account. To play it safe, I've doctored the last few pages of this notebook to look like a German-Russian vocabulary, which I can always show to any Russian who comes bursting in and wants to see what I'm writing. I actually had to do this on one occasion, and was promptly rewarded with praise and a pat on the shoulder. Towards evening we heard some commotion, someone kicking and pounding at the front door. I opened it a crack, keeping the chain on, and caught a glimpse of something white. The baker from Tuesday morning, in his military-issue smock. He wanted to come in. I didn't want him to, and acted as if Anatole were inside. Then he asked me for some other girl, any girl, an address, a hint as to where he might find one. He said he'd give her flour for it, much flour, and me, too, for mediating. I don't know of any girl. I don't want to know any. He got pushy, forced his foot in the door, started tearing at the chain. With difficulty, I managed to push him out and slam the door. Yes, girls are a commodity increasingly in short supply. Now everyone's ready when the men go on the hunt for women, so they lock up their girls, hide them in the crawl spaces, pack them off to secure apartments. At the pump, people whisper about a woman doctor who's fixed up a room in the air raid shelter as a quarantine hospital, with big signs in German and Russian warning of typhus. But the patients are just very young girls from the neighbouring apartment buildings, and the quarantine is a ruse the doctor came up with to preserve their virginity. A little later we heard more noise. 2 men we hadn't seen before had managed to get into the empty apartment next door. The wall separating the apartments from ours was damaged in one of the last air raids, so that there's a hole about 6 feet up, nearly a foot wide. The men next door must have shoved a table against the wall right under the hole. They started shouting through the chink that we'd better open our door at once or they'd shoot us. Apparently they didn't realise our back door was wide open. One of the men shone his torch into our hall, the other levelled his automatic. But we know they're never quite that trigger-happy, especially not when they're as sober and quick-tongued as these two seem to be. So I put on a silly act, attempting to be funny in Russian. Anyway, they were just 2 boys, not a hair on their chins. I cajoled them and even lectured them about the ukaz of great comrade Stalin. Finally they got down from their shooting gallery, kicked our front door a bit with their boots, and left. So we breathed a sigh of relief. It's somewhat reassuring to know that if need be, I can run upstairs and call one of Anatole's men to help. By now, most of them know that we're Anatole's private game reserve. Even so, the widow started feeling more and more uneasy, especially when evening came and none of our usual guests showed up. Taking advantage of a calm moment in the stairwell, she darted upstairs to establish contact with the other residents. 10 minutes later she was back. "Please come up to Frau Wendt's. There are some very nice Russians. It's downright pleasant."
End of Side 3. Side 4.
Frau Wendt is the woman with the weeping eczema. On her own, around 50, the one who tied her wedding ring to her pants. It turns out that she's moved in with the former housekeeper for our westward departed landlord. Another example of the rampant regrouping, random alliances forming out of fear and need. Their small kitchen was stuffy and full of tobacco smoke. In the candlelight I could make out both women and 3 Russians. The table in front of them was piled with canned goods, mostly without labels, presumably German provisions now turned Russian booty. One of the Russians immediately handed the widow one of the tins. The women asked me not to speak any Russian, so I just played stupid. None of these Russians knew me. One, named Seryosha, squeezed right up to me and put his arm around my hip, whereupon one of the others intervened and said, in a gentle voice, "Brother, please, none of that," and Seryosha, caught in the act, moved away. I'm amazed. The man who spoke is young, with a handsome face and dark, regular features. His eyes are bright. His hands are white and slender. He looks at me seriously and says in clumsy German, "Nicht haben Angst," not to be afraid. Frau Wendt whispers to the widow and me that this Russian is called Stepan. He lost his wife and 2 children in a German air raid on Kiev, but he's forgiven us all and is practically a saint. Next, the 3rd Russian, who's small and pockmarked, shoves me a can of meat that he's opened with his penknife. He hands me the knife and gestures for me to eat. I spear a few large, fatty pieces and stick them in my mouth. I'm hungry. All 3 Russians look at me approvingly. Then Frau Wendt opens her kitchen cupboard and shows us row after row of canned goods, all brought by the 3 men. It really is pleasant here. At the same time, neither of the 2 women could be called attractive. Frau Wendt has her eczema, and the ex-housekeeper is like a mouse, worried, withered, and bespectacled. Enough to give a rapist second thoughts. Heaven only knows why these men have set up here, dragging all those cans of food. I'd be happy to stay longer. Stepan positively radiates protection. I gaze at him open-mouthed, and in my mind rename him Alyosha from the brothers Karamazov. But the widow's getting restless. She's concerned about Herr Pauli, all alone in his bed, although it's clear that our men, especially those who are sick and bedridden, have nothing to fear from the Russians. It's impossible to imagine one of these soldiers swinging his hips and approaching a man with a whispered, "Let's go." They're all hopelessly normal. Seryosha takes the candle and escorts us to the door, pious as a lamb under Stepan's eye, risking no more than a gentle pinch on my upper arm as we leave. We trot downstairs, each with our own can of meat. We hear happy music coming from our apartment, and find things there in high gear. Practically all of Anatole's contingent are camped out in the living room, having let themselves in through the eternally open back door. Somewhere they've come up with an accordion, and are taking turns. They all try their hand at playing, but none of them really knows how, and the results are as expected. Even so, they're laughing and enjoying themselves. After all, it's May Day, and they want to celebrate. No one knows where Anatole is. They say he's out on business. He has a lot to take care of. We go into Herr Pauli's bedroom and find Russians there as well. The sullen lieutenant with his hiking pole covered in badges, and someone else he's evidently brought along, whom he introduces off-handedly as Major Ovich so-and-so. They have a way of whispering and mumbling both their patronymics and their last names. They want to keep their identities secret, so they never say more than a typical-sounding first name and their rank, which you can figure out anyway if you know what to look for. I stare at the blonde lieutenant, full of loathing, and wish him elsewhere. He acts as if he doesn't know me, distant and formal and flawlessly polite. The major he's brought along is even more polite, leaping to his feet when we enter, bowing as if at a dance lesson, greeting each of us individually. Tall and slender, dark hair, clean uniform. One of his legs drags a little. After a moment I notice a third person in the room, another new face. He has been sitting motionless by the window. Now the major calls him over, and he steps our way, blinking in the candlelight. An Asian, with thick jaws and narrow, swollen eyes. They introduce him as the major's orderly, and then the man immediately withdraws to his corner by the window, where he turns up the collar of his grey woolen coat to help against the wind blowing in from outside. Now 4 of us are sitting around Pauli's bed. The widow, me, the surly blonde lieutenant, and the major, who does all the talking. He asks me to translate his polite flourishes and carefully weighed words for Herr Pauli and the widow. He thinks they're married. As we carry on our exchange, the major and I size each other up furtively. I don't know what to make of the man, so I keep an eye on him. He offers some cigars that he's been carrying loose in his jacket pocket. Pauli thanks him, takes 2 and lights one, puffing away with help from the major. They smoke a while in peace and quiet. Now and then the major holds the ashtray out for Herr Pauli, very politely. All of a sudden he jumps up and asks if he is disturbing us, in which case he'll leave right away at once, and he makes a show of getting ready to leave. No, no, we beg to differ, he's not bothering us. He sits back down immediately and goes on smoking in silence. A perfect model of etiquette. Another completely new sample from the apparently inexhaustible collection the USSR has sent our way. What's more, he's visibly nervous. His hand with the cigar is shaking. Or maybe he has a fever. We've just learned that he's been wounded in the knee. He was in the same hospital as the lieutenant, which is how they know each other. So the Russians are in the hospital as well. I'd like to know how they managed to squeeze in, and where they sent our people, who as of last week had filled every bed in every available space. Meanwhile, the Glee Club has taken its accordion and moved on out of our apartment. Things quieten down. I steal a peek at the lieutenant's watch. The hands are nearing 11. The widow, Herr Pauli and I swap glances, unsure what to expect from these guests. Now the major gives an order to the Asian by the window, who reaches in his coat pocket and barely manages to pull out a bona fide bottle of the best German champagne. He places it on the stand next to Pauli's bed, in the pool of candlelight. In no time the widow is off for glasses, and we clink and sip champagne, while the major and the surly lieutenant carry on a quiet conversation that's evidently not meant for me. Finally, the major faces me directly and asks, "What do you know about fascism?" His voice is as stern and strict as a schoolmaster's. "Fascism?" I stutter. "Yes, please. Explain the origin of the word. Name the country where this political movement originated." I think desperately for a moment, then blurt something about Italy, Mussolini, the ancient Romans, fascio as a bundle of rods, which I try to illustrate using the lieutenant's badge-covered stick. And all the while my hands and knees can't stop shaking because I suddenly think I know what this Major represents and what he's after. He wants to subject me to a political exam, ferret out my beliefs, my past, all in order to draft me into some Russian job as an interpreter or army helper. Who knows? I see myself being dragged off and enslaved somewhere in some war-torn town. Or are these GPU men hoping to recruit me as an informer? 100 horrible thoughts flash in my mind. I can feel my hands turning to lead and dropping. I can hardly finish what I'm saying. I must have blanched because the widow looks at me, though she doesn't understand a word we're saying. She's obviously concerned, puzzled. Then I hear the Major speaking to the blonde lieutenant. He sounds satisfied. Yes, she does have a decent knowledge of politics. And he raises his glass and drinks my health. I breathe with relief, my heart stuck in my throat. Apparently I've passed the exam, which was only designed to test my basic knowledge. I finish my glass, which is refilled with the last of the champagne. The widow's eyes are drooping. It's time for the guests to leave. Suddenly, there's a new tone, an open proposition. The lieutenant sums it up in 2 sentences. Here is the Major. He wants to ask you, citizen, if you find him pleasant. Out of the clouds and back to earth, I stare at the 2 men, dumbfounded. All of a sudden the Major is fiddling with his cigar, carefully stubbing it out in the ashtray, as if he hadn't heard what the lieutenant asked on his behalf. It's so dark I can't make out the orderly who's still sitting mutely by the window. No champagne for him. Silence. The widow looks at me, lifting her shoulders inquiringly. Then the lieutenant, toneless, calm. Do you find the Major pleasant? Can you love him? Love. That damned word. I can't hear it any more. I'm so shaken, so disheartened that I don't know what to say or what to do. After all, the lieutenant is part of Anatole's circle, so he knows about the taboo. Does this mean Anatole is no longer around? Could this Major be his successor in the field? And does he think that means he can inherit me as well? He can't be thinking that. He's just told us that he's been staying in the hospital, that he has a bed there. I stand up and say, No, I don't understand. The lieutenant follows me through the room, limping on his stick, while the Major goes on sitting by Paoli's bedside, seemingly detached, looking right past the 2 Germans, frozen there in silence, helpless and scared. I murmur to the lieutenant, And Anatole? What about Anatole? What Anatole? He shouts, coarsely, loudly. What do you mean, Anatole? The man's long gone. He's been transferred to staff headquarters. Anatole? Gone? Just like that, without a word? Is it true? But the lieutenant sounds so certain, so superior, so scornful. My head is spinning. Now the Major gets up as well, says goodbye to the widow and Herr Paoli with great ceremony. I hear him thanking them repeatedly for their hospitality. Neither Paoli nor the widow has the faintest idea of the procuring being conducted. And I don't dare speak to them in German right in front of the other 2. I know from experience that the Russians don't like that. They immediately suspect conspiracy, treason. The Major heads towards the door, bowing to all of us. The Asian comes waddling over from the window. I hold my candle up to light the way out for all 3. The Major traipses very slowly through the hall, his right leg dragging slightly. He's clearly doing his best to minimize the limping. The lieutenant shoves me with his elbow, asks rudely, Well? You mean you're thinking about it? Then there's a short discussion between him and the Major about where to spend the night, whether in the hospital or... And once again the lieutenant asks me, coldly but politely, Could we possibly spend the night here, all 3 of us? And he points to the Major and to the Asian standing beside them half asleep. All 3? Yes, why not? That way we have protection for the night, so I lead the three of them to the back room next to the kitchen. There's a broad